Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished law professor at Rutgers Law School and director of the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights, also known as CSRR. You can learn more about the center by visiting our website at csrr.rutgers.edu or following us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR or on Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook at RUCSRR. The Race and Rights Podcast explores the myriad issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, here and abroad. Today's podcast is entitled White Christian Privilege, the Illusion of Religious Equality in America. Our guest, Professor Khyati Joshi, analyzes Christianity's influence on the American experiment from before the founding of the Republic to the social movement of today. She charts Christianity's influence through centuries of slavery, westward expansion, immigration, and citizenship laws to reveal the ways Christian privilege in the United States has always been entangled with notions of white supremacy. Let's hear what our guest has to say about this important topic.
Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joshi. She is a public intellectual whose social science research and community connections inform policymakers, educators, and everyday people about race, religion, and immigration in 21st century America. She is the author of the book that she will be presenting today, a new book by NYU Press called White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Freedom in America. She is also the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Envisioning Religion, Race, and Asian Americans, and was author and co-editor of Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, one of the most widely used books by diversity practitioners and social justice scholars alike. Dr. Joshi is a professor of education at Farley Dickinson University and a social science researcher whose work focuses on the intersections of race and religion in the United States. She frequently consults with school districts, faith communities, and business on fostering equity and inclusion. She is also well known for creating the Institute for Teaching Diversity and Social Justice, which offers multi-day professional development programs for educators since 2007. She has presented her research to scholars around the world and inspired audiences in the United States and abroad. And for that reason, for many reasons, we are so honored to have Dr. Joshi with us today. And I personally am very grateful for her taking the time to educate us about this very important new book that she has just published that can't be more timely at this moment in America's political history. So without further ado, I will pass the virtual stage to Professor Joshi.
Thank you so much for having me as part of the series, and particularly I'm really excited to be kicking off the lecture series talking about my book. I'm very delighted that you have the center where these topics can be highlighted and focused upon for scholars, for students, for everyday people. I'm going to talk about my book, White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. And before I kind of jump into it, I want to talk about why I wrote this book and a couple of things to keep in mind while you're listening to me. And if you go on to read the book, or maybe some of you have already read it, it's also available as an audio book, an ebook. This book project is both a personal and professional one. Professionally, I saw over the last, decade and a half, or so, more and more work coming out on whiteness in America and the development of whiteness. However, in all of those wonderful resources, one thing was missing, and that was really the explicit role of religion, and examining the explicit role of religion in the development of whiteness. And it's there, and I'm going to talk about that a little today. So that's really my professional reason for writing this book. The personal one is that as a racial and religious minority, I have lived white Christian privilege my whole life. And actually, until graduate school, when I was exposed to the concept of privilege, I didn't have the language to be able to articulate what I was experiencing. And so for me, that is my hope, is that readers of the book, whether you agree or not, whether you like the book or not, have language to be able to talk about these issues. Because in our country today, that's what we need. We need to be reading and listening, and then also taking action, which involves discussing things. So that's kind of my hope and why I wrote the book. Now, when I teach about these topics, I keep in mind the head, the heart, and the hand. When writing this book, when teaching, when doing my workshops, or any of the things I engage in around race, religion, social justice. And that is when it's about, we have to have information, right? So that's why y'all are here listening and you read books and listen to podcasts and all, so that we can gain information. But there's also the heart piece, right? And the heart piece is not just about caring, though that's what some people think it's about. The heart piece is understanding the affective component of learning. It is understanding the emotional reaction you have to white Christian privilege and the concepts I'll be presenting. So if you find yourself getting angry or bothered or your heart racing, it's important to take notice of that, because those emotions manifest in different ways. They can manifest where you want to know more. They can manifest where you want to check out and leave the room. They can manifest in arguments and being argumentative, for example, in classrooms, which I've certainly faced over the years. But it's not a negative thing. It's important to understand that it's the affective component of learning. And then, of course, there's the hand of the head, heart, and hand. And the hand is about taking action, right? So we are learning, but then we have to do something with the learning. So that's how I approach my work. That's how I've approached this book. Now, when we're talking about white Christian privilege, actually, sometimes I'm talking about white Christian privilege, and sometimes I'm talking about Christian privilege. So I try to be as accurate as possible, understanding that there are both concepts, and we'll get into those in just a second. But think about what we know as what's considered normal when we think about religion, when we think about prayer, and that will get you in the mindset of thinking about white Christian privilege. The way I think about Christian privilege and religious oppression and white privilege and racism. Okay, so we have the country, and here are two forms of oppression, racism and religious oppression. And then our oppressions are a system of advantages and disadvantages based on a particular identity. So if we're talking about, I'm going to actually start over here with racism. Racism is about folks who have white privilege and folks who encounter prejudice, right? People of color. So when we take the parallel concept of religious oppression, the folks who have advantages are folks who have Christian privilege. And historically, we really, to be accurate, really should talk about Protestant Christian, because the United States has a long and drawn out history of anti-Catholicism, and I'll get to that. And the folks who encounter the disadvantages because of the presence of religious oppression are religious minorities, okay? And this oppression, both religious oppression and racism, exists at three levels. They exist at the individual level, which is often where people think bias and discrimination happens. And it certainly does, but that's not the only place, right? There's the societal cultural level. This is the part of our lives where we have these like social mores and unspoken rules and norms about how one behaves, what's considered normal, what's othered. And then there's the institutional level. And the institutional level is just what it sounds like, where oppression exists in our institutions, government, business, healthcare, and so on, education, okay? So now we can actually hone in and take on specifically the idea of Christian privilege, religious oppression, and the prejudice against religious minorities, right? And here you'll see that I've replaced the three levels with the phrases that I use in the book. So Christian hegemony is really about how all of this manifests at the institutional level. Christian normativity is kind of, you could think of it as business as usual also, and what's considered normal. And then Christian privilege is really at the individual level, where Christian folks have advantages, where society has been made for them. And remember, privilege is a product of oppression, right? So Christian privilege is a product of systemic religious oppression over the history of this country. People who have Christian privilege and white Christian privilege didn't do a darn thing to have it, except for to be part of that group, okay? It is the accumulation of advantages over time, over generations. So that's an important piece about understanding privilege. Now, the thing is that when we're talking, I'm going to stop sharing here for a little bit. When we're talking about Christian hegemony, when we're talking about the institutional level, we can talk laws, we can talk history. And indeed, Christian privilege is built into the edifice of American law. If we take the First Amendment, some of the free exercise cases that are associated with the First Amendment, we see distinctions between belief and action. Actually, that's a really enduring theme in the free exercise cases. Protestant religious practice typically has been more about beliefs than about taking, like religiously mandated action. So yes, of course, folks go to church and participate in the sacraments, but it's really, really about belief. So I'm going to actually share, we have 3 cases of several that I just want to highlight. There's the Goldman case in 1986 that dealt with the issue of head coverings. There is what we call, often referred to as the peyote case, which was in 1990 when employees were subjected to a drug test and then not hired because the drug test came back positive and they had ingested peyote as part of a ritual. And so it was contested. And then there's the Ling case, which is the issue of land and what's considered sacred and what's not, the idea of the veneration of nature. And what we see in all of these cases is that the courts, in all of these cases, one could argue that the court was upholding an outcome that kind of affects everyone equally, that there should be military uniformity. You can't have different head coverings. Of course, there should be a ban on illegal drugs. And, this idea of recognizing traditions of a particular group associated with nature just didn't really make sense, right? Sometimes the courts will use the phrase facially neutral. They made decisions that are facially neutral. However, the truth is that Christianity has been the face of facially neutral, okay? Because if Protestant Christian practice included devotional head covering, then Dr. Goldman sued, and actually many Sikh soldiers in recent years would not have to fight those fights, okay? If Protestant Christians use peyote in their religious practice, it would have never been declared an illegal drug in the first place. And if Protestant Christians and Christianity at large recognize the notion of sacred lands and called for spiritually important natural spaces to be undisturbed, like the logging operations in Ling, would have never commenced, right? And it's actually, nature veneration is there in various indigenous rituals. It's there in Hinduism and Buddhism. It's prevalent in many different religious practices. Thus, Christians will never experience a facially neutral ban on their practices, and the burden of government regulation kind of always falls on religious minorities. Another place where we see a Christian hegemony actually is, we can look at history, right? And so very briefly, just, these are a few events that you can look more into, but there's the doctrine of discovery, which was a set of papal decrees in the 15th century that essentially said if the explorers, we would identify as colonizers, I should say, came upon land that was uninhabited by Christians, then it was theirs to take, okay? Another example is the Civilization Act of 1819, which provided Presbyterian missionaries with federal funds to civilize, i.e. convert Native American and indigenous peoples. We have several immigration acts, which I'll speak about later, as well as naturalization acts, citizenship laws, where we see the presence of Christian hegemony. And even in the impact of the executive order of 9066, which is the executive order signed by President Roosevelt interning Japanese and Japanese Americans, we can see how those who were Japanese Christian were impacted in a slightly different way than those who were not, okay? We also have Christian normativity, okay? That's at the sociocultural level. So what does this mean? Well, consider how folks worship, okay? Place and group practice. What's considered normal? Going to a church once a week. Some religions don't have a weekly worship place. You don't need that. The idea of building a house of worship. So we have freedom of religion in the First Amendment, but that doesn't mean all religious groups have been able to practice their faiths freely. We have countless examples across the country of gurudwaras, of masjids, of Hindu temples, of synagogues facing opposition when communities were trying to construct those houses of worship. We have architectural norms. So church steeples aren't a problem, but minarets sometimes, or tradition or Hindu temples constructed in South Indian tradition have been, right? What about how we think about the image of God? It's typically the cover of my book, right? The white-haired male God, right? But what about the fact that actually some faiths have no image and some religious traditions have variety of images, right? What do we think about as the normal way of praying? And there is the normal way, and then other ways are othered, literally. And now we can think about Christian privilege at the individual level. Okay, so a few examples, and then I'll talk about them, is this idea as a Christian, I can run for office and my religion not be brought into question. American English idioms and metaphors incorporate my religion and religious stories for a Christian. As a Christian, I can protest and my patriotism is not questioned. As a Christian, when I swear on an oath on my holy book, my credibility won't be questioned. And as a Christian, I can have my religious event at a venue of my choosing without changing or giving up rituals, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about these. I think we can see the first one I talked about where I can run for office and my religion not be brought into question. And the example I talk about in the book, and we have unfortunately too many examples from present day, is actually Governor Nikki Haley of South Carolina. She grew up sick and she converted to Christianity. Specifically, she identifies as Methodist. And when she was running for office in South Carolina, her campaign would receive emails asking if she was a Christian, because then, some emails were like, well, if she's a Christian, she can represent me. If she's not, I'm not sure she can represent me. So eventually her campaign added a tab, Nikki is a Christian, right? So this idea that you're going to have to be Christian and in many cases white to really be able to run for office, because otherwise then we can get into the patriotism one. American English idioms and metaphors incorporate my religion and religious stories. There was a time I was in 9th grade in English class. I didn't do very well in English class in high school. I couldn't connect to anything. And my teacher was teaching us about similes and metaphors. And she said, okay, well, simile and metaphor, okay, blah, 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 blah. Well, you know the story of the Good Samaritan. And she's talking to the class. I didn't know what she was talking about, right? But it was also, I understood that I was supposed to know what this is, and I was not about to raise my hand and say I didn't understand. And so I went through the whole class not really understanding the emphasis, and I really didn't know who to go to talk about. So I don't think I really grasped the concepts of simile and metaphor for a long time, right? So she didn't do that on purpose, but that's how ubiquitous this is, right? And that's an example of Christian privilege in everyday life. So briefly, I do want to touch on how did we get here? Like today, we have white Christian privilege in our country. And let me be clear, sometimes, as I said, I'm talking about white Christian privilege, and sometimes I'm talking about Christian privilege because we do have Christian communities of color who also have Christian privilege. But then when we really look at, take into account intersectionality and look at our lives, how they work every day, the race element is there, right? And so that's why I think the overarching theme is always white Christian privilege or white Christian supremacy. So how did we get here? We have to really think about how religious difference turned into racial difference. The modern concept of race as we know it now emerged out of racial differences, right? We have the expulsion of the Jews and Moors from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. Then we also have to consider British colonialism in South Asia, Africa, and actually Oceania. We have the enslavement of Africans and being brought to the Western Hemisphere. We get the modern concept of race eventually. And then we actually see that in the 1800s, the term free, white, and Christian were used interchangeably. In the United States, this is really how I see it. We have to take into account Christianity and whiteness when we're thinking about three main concepts in the life of this country: genocide, slavery, and colonialism. And these three concepts have often been discussed. Scholar Andrea Smith talks about them as the pillars of white supremacy. What I think needs to be added to her very strong argument is the role Christianity has had in the construction of whiteness. So briefly, we see this when we were talking about Native American when, in terms of genocide, yes, people know about the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which contributes to whiteness, right? It's all commonly known as the Trail of Tears. We learn about it in elementary school. We don't get the full history usually. But we also have to think about issues of manifest destiny and, for example, the Civilization Act of 1819, which I described earlier, which have Christian foundations, to the Civilization Act. But also when we think about manifest destiny, taking the land from sea to shining sea because it was ordained by God for the colonizers coming over, right? That's built on the doctrine of discovery. So we have to be able to see the Christian roots that have contributed also to genocide of Native Americans. When we're talking about African American, with whiteness, we can see, the idea that African Americans were considered 3/5 of a human being. Of course, the issue of slavery, and then subsequently Jim Crow laws and the issues that continue to happen today against African Americans. We have to also take into account the biblical justification for slavery and see the role that it played. And there's, many things written about the role of racism in Christianity and the subjugation of African Americans. Then we have to consider Asian American and Hispanic folks and thinking about colonialism, right? So we can think about immigration policy and citizenship, but we have to also consider the role of Christianity because we see the social and legal exclusion of non-Protestants. Okay, specifically, we have a long history of anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. Although folks encountered that form of discrimination, they were legally accepted as white and could be citizens, which was not the case for those coming from Asia and present-day Middle East. And of course, there's a lot of case law showing how folks became white and petitioned the courts and sued the courts to be considered white so that they could gain citizenship. I'm not going to go into other history here, but I do want to offer a path forward, right? A path towards justice, because this book for me is about taking action. In terms of building a more perfect union, I talk about a blueprint of 5 things to change: changing the language, changing the questions, changing the focus, changing the paradigm, and changing our foundational assumptions. So I'm just going to hit on a couple of these. So changing the question, this can go in a couple of different ways. On a very individual level, on the micro level, instead of asking folks, well, what's your Christmas? Which, let me tell you, I can't count the number of times I've been asked, what's my Christmas or what's my Bible? Can we consider the fact that, what's the most significant religious celebration for you? Granted, I know that takes up more words and we're often looking for the shortest way of doing everything, but that's not going to always work, right? Or what are sacred scriptures what religious sacred scriptures are holy for you, or something like that, right? So we have to reframe our questions. But then there are more meta questions. The more meta questions that I want to see changed. Right now, the moral questions of America get defined by what is important to conservative Christians. So the moral questions of America are usually the discussions are around abortion, around marriage equality or same-sex marriage, and topics like that. But who got to define those questions? Conservative Christians, right? I think a moral question is environmental justice. Like, what are we doing about environmental justice? So we have to kind of take a stand and reframe questions, moral questions in our country that work for the larger majority, right? I want to say change the paradigm. Change the paradigm here is that often we think about, like in interfaith movements, how are we all similar? And that's not going to cut it. We really need to be thinking about how we are different, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. So we're going to have to focus on difference. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing, though it's often been seen as a negative thing. But we're going to have to see that all religious groups are not on equal footing in this country. And so if you're having inter-religious dialogue and interfaith actions, you have to take into account Christian privilege and white Christian privilege. And finally, I'll end with change foundational assumptions. And one example I can give you of that is that I am a proponent of saying Merry Christmas during the holidays. I think it's really important. I know that as a Hindu, I love to hear Happy Diwali. Sometimes not only do people not say it, I don't even get a happy holidays. But happy holidays, I understand for those who are Christian why it feels diluted, why it feels like their religion is being done away with. And I'm all in favor of saying Merry Christmas, right? With saying that, I also then think we have to be able to wish people a happy Diwali, a Hag Sameach for Passover, Eid Mubarak. We have to know those things. We have to have religious literacy.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.